Hello, thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins. My name is Laura, and today I'm doing my October reading wrap-up. But before we get started, I want to apologize for the audio because it is probably more echoey than usual, and that is because we are getting ready to move, hence my empty bookshelves. And I also had like echo-proof things on the wall as well as a rug, but now the rug and that is all gone, so I'm just in kind of an empty room with wood floors. So it probably sounds very echoey, so I apologize for that. But it is very exciting that we're moving. So excited, we finally bought a house. Market has been crazy, but it finally worked out, so that is awesome. But I'm also recording this video on October 26th, so it's earlier than I usually would record. But I have already finished 10 books this month, and there's still time that I could potentially finish yet another one. But if I do read another one, it will have to be part of my November wrap-up because we are moving in less than a week, so I needed to get this filmed. Anyway, so yeah, it was a record-breaking month, 10 books. Usually I read like 8 books in a month. I think like packing, I listen to more audiobooks. I've been running more, so I always listen to an audiobook while running. So audiobooks have really helped me read more this month. And I read a lot of fantastic books. A lot of them were like on the cusp of being like a 5-star great book, but there was something about it that made me be like, it was more like 4 stars. But even so, a lot of these are books I would definitely recommend. So let's just get right to it. And for those who don't know, I talk about, in these monthly wrap-ups, I talk about the books in order from the one I liked the least to the one I liked the most. So beginning with a book I gave 2 stars, my lowest rated book this month, that was The Uninvited by Dorothy McArdle. My book first movie for this came out on Wednesday, so I will link to that if you want to hear me talk about this one more. But this one is about a brother and sister who buy a house, and they find out that this house is haunted by 2 ghosts, and that these ghosts had known each other in life, and so the brother and sister are figuring out what the drama was between these two in order to, try to get them out and be able to move on with the afterlife, And that premise, sounds like it would be such an interesting book, right? But I just found it really boring and not suspenseful, not thrilling, not scary. I was just wanting it to hurry and wrap up. It's 350 pages, which isn't crazy long, but I feel like it could have been shorter. There were scenes we didn't really need. And this is one where it took me 2 weeks to read because every time I set it down, I just had a hard time being motivated to pick it up again. But I did ultimately finish it, slowly but surely. And yeah, ultimately it's not one I would recommend. Stick with the movie on this one. I do really enjoy the movie, but the book just wasn't what I wanted from a haunted house story. And then number 9 is The Hollow Places by T. Kingfisher. This is the second Kingfisher book I read this month. The first one I read, I ranked higher, so we'll be talking about that later. But this one I read second, and I did go into it with high expectations because I loved her other books so much. And this one had great reviews on Goodreads from booktubers I follow on there. So I went into it with high expectations, I will admit. But this, we follow a woman who is recently divorced and she is broke. And so she moves in with her uncle who owns this weird museum. It's the Wonder Museum, and he has a lot of taxidermy and just a lot of random artifacts. And it's just this really quirky museum, and her uncle is kind of a quirky guy, and he has a spare room in the museum. So she moves in, we get to know her uncle, this museum, as well as the guy who works next door at the coffee shop, and it's in this small town. And this setup, the first quarter of the book, I was loving. I loved the vibe of this small town and this quirky museum and the coffee shop. And I was just really enjoying living in that world with this character. And then eventually this character and the coffee shop guy end up finding another dimension through a hole in the wall and go into this other world. And you would think wow, that must be when it got good. But for me, that's when I kind of started to lose interest. And I was just I assumed that the rest of the book was going to take place in that world. And so I was oh man, this is going to be tough to get through because I'm already just not very interested in this. And it reminded me a lot of the Chronicles of Narnia, which the characters in the book do directly reference the Chronicles of Narnia as well as the Magician's Nephew, because this world is the world between worlds in the Magician's Nephew. And also it's in her uncle's museum, and the Magician's Nephew, it was about an uncle and his nephew. So definitely similarities there, which she acknowledges in the book. But it also was reminding me a lot of the Southern Reach trilogy, Area X and that other dimension, that other world. So it had a lot of similar vibes as that did. However, I absolutely love the Southern Reach trilogy, and that's one where when they are in Area X, I love reading about that because it's just so weird and so unsettling and so bizarre and creepy. Whereas here, maybe because it kept reminding me of Area X, it just wasn't as bizarre and weird because I felt like I had already read about this kind of thing happening before. And there's a lot of sarcastic humor in this book, which I don't mind that here and there, but I felt like it was too much and it took away from like the creepiness or the suspense and I get to that is how some people deal with stressful things, is they make jokes about it, right? And that's what these characters do. But yeah, I just thought it was too much and it kind of took away from the atmosphere in my mind. And this one I gave 3 stars. Like, I didn't hate it. And it's not a spoiler to say that eventually they do leave that world. And so once they got back to reality, I did start to become more invested once again. And there are some creepy moments. But yeah, I guess I was just wanting it to be more creepy and more trippy than it ended up being. And also the ending just kind of ties things up too neatly. I don't love when books do that, when like every little thing is explained and tied up. Like, it's just too much. Like, after the main climax and the plot is resolved, the book can end soon after. I don't need to know every little detail about all the characters and what ended up happening, you know? So that's just my personal preference. So yeah, this one, I mean, I'd recommend it if you're into sci-fi fantasy, I suppose. But as far as like that other world goes, I would recommend the Southern Reach trilogy, because that one, I loved being in Area X and reading about that, and it was fantastic. Whereas this one, I was just wanting them to like hopefully get out of this other world, because I just wasn't particularly enjoying it, which there were some creepy things. So I don't want to insult the book too much and act like it wasn't imaginative enough, because it was. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe the humor just really took away from it ultimately for me. And then number 8 on the list, which by the way, I'm like happy with those bottom 2. I feel good about placing them there. But a lot of these books in between right here that we're getting to are like 3.5 to 4 stars. And I had such a hard time figuring out how to put them in order. And this is by no means like written in stone, even though I'm putting it out here on the internet. Like, in my mind down the road, I might look back and be like, I don't agree with that placement, and I would probably switch these books around. So this is by no means my it is final because I'm making my video for it, but basically I had a hard time figuring out how to order these. So anyway, take it as you will. But number 8 is My Sister, the Serial Killer. And this one I was hesitant to read. I loved the cover and it seemed interesting, but I was hesitant to read it because I was worried it would just be like too twisted and disturbing. However, I saw Mariana from Impression Blend. I follow her on Goodreads, and she left a review saying how this book was really about the relationship between these 2 sisters. And that's what this book is truly about, not necessarily the killer aspect. And so that sold me. And so I decided to read it. And I did really enjoy this one. It is like 225 pages or something. It's fairly short, but I actually wish it was longer, because there's a number of things that are like we scratch the surface on, but then we just scratch the surface and that's it. And I was wishing she would have like delved deeper into certain aspects. And I also feel like the ending was pretty underwhelming, and I just wanted more suspense and more drama, I guess. Whereas things are resolved pretty quickly. And again, it's just all tied up so neatly. And it's like, wait, what? Like, I wanted to explore like these other possibilities and these other themes and these other events that you mentioned, but then she didn't really elaborate on it as much as I would have liked. But this is basically, as the title says, it's about a woman who has a sister who kills men, and she calls the sister to help her clean up afterwards. And so it's not graphic because we don't see any of these things take place. And so it is about their codependent relationship that they have. And it also deals with like pretty privilege, because the sister is just gorgeous and stunning. And so when our narrator, which I think it's written from the third person. Anyway, when the other sister, Corday, when she's telling someone, she's trying to warn someone about her sister, and instead they respond being like, oh, like, I know you're probably jealous of her because she's so pretty and she's always dating, but you really shouldn't act out in this way by like trying to spread these lies about her and blah, 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 whatever. And so those moments, seeing like the manipulation of the sister and how people treat her differently because of her beauty, it was so frustrating. And so it helps you really are on the side of Corday and just the struggle that she is living with her sister. But then at the same time, she loves her sister. And we do hear about their childhood and certain events in their past that caused them both to be the way they are. So ultimately, like, I would recommend this book and I did really like it, but I gave it 3.5 because I was just wishing there was more to it. So I definitely want to read more by this author. She has a shorter story, like it's 150 pages that she released in 2020 that like deals with COVID. So I am curious to read that one. It definitely made me interested in reading more by her. And this one I would definitely recommend. And if you're worried about it being graphic or something, you don't need to worry about that because there are things with their past that are upsetting, but it's not like graphically violent or anything. So you don't need to worry about that. But yeah, a really interesting look into the bond between these two sisters and the codependent relationship that they have. Number 7 on the list is the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. I've been hearing about Grady Hendrix a lot lately on like Bookstagram and BookTube. And so I decided to read this one because it seemed very fitting for the month of October. And at the time I was also just wanting like a fun read, a fun book that was easy to read. And the audiobook is narrated by Bonnie Turpin, who is one of my favorite narrators. Highly recommend the audiobook for this one. But this, we have our main character, Patricia, which by the way, Grady Hendrix is a man and his main character is Patricia, and she's part of a book club with all these other women. And so it is a very female focused book. And honestly, if I had not known this was written by a man, I probably wouldn't have thought it was written by a man. So I thought he did a good job at, telling this story from a female's perspective personally. And it's about a female who loves to read and is part of this book club. And so I just love that aspect and the female friendship within this book. And also how the women are the one who are taking on this vampire, I thought was really cool. And Grady Hendrix said that he wanted to like pit his mom against Dracula. And so that's kind of what we get here. And this book, I thought of rating it higher, but there's like one element in particular that I just didn't like, and it made me uncomfortable, like in a bad way. So it made me rate it lower, and because it just seemed unnecessary and over the top. It's not a spoiler to say that, vampires have always been considered, sexual, and it's related to sex in some way with sucking blood, and he takes it to the next level. He takes it like to the next 3 levels or something. He goes too far with it. And it also deals with children. So I did not like that. And I thought it was unnecessary at how far he went with it at times. But nonetheless, I thought it was really well written, and it's funny and exciting and it's thrilling. And it's also just like so infuriating. It's so infuriating because the men in this book are like all just the biggest pieces of trash ever. Like there's not one single likable guy. Even the main character's son is so frustrating. And so part of me, like, it was almost too much. Like I wish there was at least one decent man in this story, but they are all just like so demeaning and condescending to their wives. And part of me thought that Hendrix would straight up say, like, the presence of the vampire brought out all this negativity in the men. Like he had an influence on them that made them doubt their wives and be prideful and be greedy and lustful. And I do think that's true though. I think the vampire's presence does bring that out in them, even though Hendrix never straight up says, he never makes that connection per se, but I think it is told to us by example that the vampire does try to bring out like what's worse in men, I would say. Which I feel like I'm trying to make excuses for how terrible the men are in this book, but I get Hendrix was also just trying to show the sexism and how men doubt women, and they're just like, you're just some housewife who reads your silly books, like what do you know? You're over imaginative, you're over emotional. And so I get what he was going for, and it was like really frustrating, which I think is what he wanted. But there were times where it almost felt like too much. But there are also scenes involving rats and cockroaches and dead raccoons and just other gross scenes. So I would say that you need to have a strong stomach to read this because there were parts that were very gross, and I would not recommend I wouldn't recommend eating while reading this book. But all in all, I did enjoy this, and I would recommend it to the right kind of person. And moving on to number 6, we have Three Assassins by Kotaro Isaka. This is like a prequel to Bullet Train. The two of them like are standalone books, but Bullet Train references characters that are in Three Assassins. And I think when you read them both, it helps you appreciate both all the more. And this one, as I was reading it, I was thinking like when I was around the halfway point, I was enjoying it a lot. And it has a lot of what I loved in Bullet Train, where it's like the action, the dark humor, while also having a lot of heart to it and great unique characters. But as I was listening to it, because I listened to this on audio, I was thinking it would probably be like a 3 or a 3.5 star book. However, Isaka is great at writing endings. Bullet Train had a fantastic ending, And then this one, there's a scene in the end that I just loved so much, and it made me bump it up to a 4-star book because I just love a great ending, right? And it's the thing that you leave with a movie and a book. Like, the ending is kind of like you leave with that in your mind more so than any other part of the book in some ways. And so a good ending is so important. And Three Assassins has a fantastic ending that I loved, and so it bumped it up to 4 stars. And I also just loved Bullet Train so much too, so I was just so excited to get into this one. And yeah, ultimately it didn't disappoint, and I really enjoyed it. And if you like Bullet Train, you should definitely check out Three Assassins. And Japan adapted this book in 2015, so I have a book first movie for it coming out in November, so definitely watch that video when it comes out. Which, by the way, I didn't really give a synopsis for this one, but there's like more than 3 assassins, but there's like 4 main characters who are each looking for the same thing, which I try to keep it kind of vague because I like going into books not knowing too many details. But it's kind of like Bullet Train, where you have this group of people who are all after the same thing. And so it's this competition between all of these like wacky, unique, shady characters. And it's just a wild ride. And I really loved it. And now number 5, 4, and 3. Again, these are all 4-star books, although I could be swayed to raise my rating even higher and maybe 4.5 or 5 potentially. So if you've read any of the following books and you think they deserve a 5-star rating, comment down below why you think they deserve it, because I definitely could be swayed. Number 5, I have The Vanishing Half, and this is by Britt Bennett, and it was all the rage when it came out in 2020. I looked it up on Goodreads, and like everybody that I follow on Goodreads had read it and gave it a review, and people on YouTube were talking about it a lot at the time. And so because of that, I did go into it with high expectations, I will say. I don't know, I guess I was just expecting more of an emotional experience. Like, I wanted a book that would make me cry, right? That's like, when a book or movie can make you cry, that's just like such a good feeling, and you want something to make you feel such strong emotion. And that didn't happen with this. However, I really liked it. It's about 2 twins who grow up in a town in the South, and they are Black, and the town is a Black town because this is the 60s. However, their skin is super, super light because this book deals with colorism, because this town, they're all Black, but they value light skin more than dark skin. And so through the decades, they have just married fellow light-skinned people. And so now, like, some of the residents, like, they could pass as white because that's how light-skinned they are. And they are very judgmental towards darker-skinned Black people. And so we have these 2 twins who have very light skin, and they end up leaving the town. And then from there, one of the twins decides that she is just going to live life pretending she is white. And so she does. And so she just disappears. And so we hear the lives of these 2 twins as one who is passing as white versus the other who is just being who she is, and eventually she has to return to her hometown. And then we also get the perspective of their daughters and how their daughters are influenced by the choices that these 2 twins had made. And so it was a really interesting look, because the one twin, Stella, she decided to pass as white because she wanted more freedom and more opportunities and to live, a better life in some ways. But really, because she is living a lie, she ends up just like building a wall around herself, right? So she ends up limiting herself even more by living this lie, even though she's living the lie because she wanted more freedom. And then with their daughters, I thought that was really interesting as well, and just how their lives ended up being so different, right? Based on the influence their mothers had on them. Like, the twins lose connection, obviously, because the one leaves, and so the daughters don't know each other. But then things get a bit more interesting when the daughters end up meeting each other in Los Angeles. And so I think at the halfway point, it gets, like, I was interested in the first half, but I think at the halfway point it picks up even more, because that is when these lives start to converge. And I did also like the romance. We have the romance between Desiree and Early, Desiree being the twin who ends up going back to her hometown at one point. I really liked their love story, and I actually wish we got more of it. But I also like the love story between Jude, Desiree's daughter, and her boyfriend, Reese. And Reese is actually transgender. And so it was cool just seeing their romance and their relationship as the years go on, because this book starts in like the 60s, and then by the end, we're in like the late 80s or 90s. And I do think the ending is realistic. Like, I think part of me wanted something different to happen in the end, but ultimately I like the ending, and I think it is realistic and just true to life, probably. And then we have The Push. This book came out last year. And again, this is one that I had heard people talk about in past YouTube videos. But this month I was able to read a lot of books that aren't based on movies, because that definitely, or books that have been adapted into movies, because that definitely dominates my reading. But this month I was able to branch out and just read a lot of books that I've been meaning to read but haven't. And so, The Vanishing Half, The Push, a lot of these books are ones that I've been wanting to read, but I just hadn't gotten to because they don't have a movie for it. But The Push is similar to The Vanishing Half in some ways because it deals with like generations. Because in The Push, we have our main character, Blythe, and her daughter, Violet. So we learn about their relationship. But we also learn about Blythe's childhood with her mom, Cecilia, as well as Cecilia and Cecilia's mom, which I forget Cecilia's Etta. Etta was her mom. So just the generation of these 4 women, including Violet, and their childhoods and how that impacted them as adults. And I love books like that. So I thought that was really interesting. And this was a book, which the audiobook, fantastic. And the book itself was so good that I was listening to it on audio when I ran, but after the first day, I was like, I can't wait till tomorrow to listen to more of it. So then I got the Kindle. So I went back and forth between audio and Kindle. And yeah, I just could not put this one down. And it is just a psychological thriller because Blythe thinks there's something wrong with her daughter. But then as we go back in time and hear about her childhood and her mom's childhood, like all of the moms just didn't want to be moms and they struggled with motherhood and struggled with showing their love and just didn't love their daughters. And so as you're hearing about these past relationships with moms and then hearing about Blythe and her daughter, you're wondering, like, is Blythe even a reliable narrator? Like, is this all in her head in some way? Like, what's going on, right? For so much of this book, I struggled to know what to rate this book because it was so good and I could not put it down and I loved the writing. But then honestly, like the last line of the book made me question if I even liked it ultimately, because I don't know I guess you could say there's a reveal at the final line of the book. And initially I didn't like it. And I was like, really? Like, it was disappointing. The good thing is it wasn't what I expected. But the bad thing is it wasn't what I expected or wanted. And so then I spent like a day trying to decide what I thought about it. And actually I came around to it and I decided that I did like the ending of that book. And real quick, I'm actually going to talk spoilers as to why I like the end. So I will have a spoiler sign up and I will have this broken into chapters. So if you do not want The Push spoiled, skip ahead to the next book. So spoilers for The Push right now. I like that in the end, we find out that Blythe was right about Violet all along and that she wasn't crazy. She wasn't an unreliable narrator. And initially, like, I wanted some kind of twist or reveal to learn that Blythe didn't know what she was talking about and that she was crazy and that she was influenced by like her past childhood and things. And like maybe all of the moms thought there was something wrong with their daughters when really there wasn't. I was expecting something like that. However, after thinking about it, I actually like that Ashley Audrain didn't go that route of like, oh, she's just a crazy lady and she didn't know what she was talking about. And just like that trope of just the emotional, unstable woman, right? And so I like that she didn't do that. And instead we find out that she was right all along. And I also liked when she actually meets Fox's new wife and just that whole thing, right? Because when she asks her about Violet's mom, the woman is like, oh, I try not to talk about it. She wasn't a very loving person. And she's getting to hear what Fox is telling this woman when this woman has been getting to know her, and that's not true, right? And so just like these ideas we have about people that we hear about but that we don't actually know and the importance of getting the full story, right? And realizing that, there's probably more to this person than what their ex has to say, right? Also, similar to Southern Book Club's Guide to Vampire Slaying, Fox was so frustrating because again, he never trusted his wife and he never believed her. And he always was demeaning and condescending. Not always, but, just more demeaning. And then when he tells her the story about Violet cutting up her clothes and he just thought it was hilarious. So like he knew that Violet would act out. And yet he just, because Blythe was always so against Violet, he felt like he had to be on Violet's side, I guess. But anyway, back to non-spoilers. I did really enjoy this book and there were a lot of nuance to the characters. And the more I think about it, the more I like it. So I probably would raise this rating ultimately, maybe 4.5 or something. On Goodreads, I gave it 4 stars, which by the way, you should follow me on Goodreads. So anyway, this is definitely one I would recommend. And again, the audiobook was fantastic. I forget the name of the narrator, but she did an amazing job. So good. And then number 3 is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And this came out in 2020. And when I looked it up, like this was all the rage in 2020. So I'm a few years behind on this one. This one was fantastic. It takes place in the 50s, I believe. And, it's called Mexican Gothic, and it takes place in Mexico. And it has a lot of those Gothic novel tropes where we have the woman going to this mysterious estate, which is very old and very creepy, and there's something mysterious going on, and these handsome men that have their secrets, and she's just like, what is happening right now? And kind of similar to some of these other books that I've talked about, this also deals with like that female bond, because she goes to this estate because her cousin lives there, and she has a very close sisterly bond with her cousin, and her cousin is sick, and so she goes there to figure out what's going on. And the cousin had married this man like very quickly, and it all happened so fast, and nobody even knows him, and so she goes there to be like, is she okay? And what are you people even all about? And this also deals a lot with sexism and racism and eugenics, because this family is trying to like pair up with other people that they find attractive in one way or another, and preferably white people, because this family is very white and pale. And it also deals with colonialism, because it's a British family that moves to Mexico, and then they start mining in Mexico, and so there was a lot of themes going on, and I thought she did a great job talking about all of these different themes while telling this Gothic story. And there are some horror elements to it. It really, like the horror elements doesn't pick up until like probably the last quarter of the book, I would say, which I went into this not knowing much, but I knew there was like some kind of mushroom. There was like some body horror thing with mushrooms. And so I kept waiting for that to happen, and it doesn't really happen until like the last quarter. But yeah, so if you don't like horror, there are like some disturbing scenes that happen in the last quarter. It wasn't anything over the top though, I didn't think. But I loved the main character. She was fantastic. There is a romance that happens like throughout this book, which I liked. Although with the ending, I have some like second thoughts about the ending ultimately, but in general, I really loved this book. I would highly recommend it, and I definitely want to read more by this author. And then number 2 is a book I did give 5 stars, and that is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. So this was the first Kingfisher book I read, and I read this one like solely because I loved the cover. I just thought it was so cool. And this one I found out is actually a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, and I actually have never read that short story. I meant to read it after finishing this one, and then I never did. But there is a Vincent Price adaptation of The Fall of the House of Usher, so I will read it at some point and probably do a book verse movie for it. But yeah, part of me was like, is my review for this book even valid, considering I haven't read what it was based on? But I think my opinion is valid, and I'm not going to gatekeep myself as to my review of this book not mattering just because I haven't read what it was based on, right? Because this isn't like, if it was a sequel, you shouldn't judge a sequel if you haven't read the first book in the series, right? But this isn't a sequel, it's just a retelling. So I get that Kingfisher didn't come up with this idea wholly on her own, and she was inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's work. But anyway, I loved this book. It's pretty short. It's like 160 pages, so definitely, goes by at a good pace. Never gives you time to be bored or anything. And in the hollow places, I said that there was too much sarcastic humor, and it kind of took away from the story. And in here, we still do get humor, but it's not like over the top, and it didn't ruin the story for me. So I thought it was a good amount. And I also love the main character. And for those who don't know The Fall of the House of Usher or this, it is about a guy who gets a letter from a woman saying that she is sick and she thinks she's dying. So he shows up to their house, the Ushers, and yeah, he sees the sister is like deathly ill, and the brother isn't doing well either. And then in this, there's also this other American doctor there. This kind of reminded me, as I was reading Mexican Gothic, it kind of reminded me of this setup because they were pretty similar. But we also have a character in this book who is like the fictional aunt of Beatrice Potter, which I thought was really cool because this takes place in England. But anyway, so similar to Mexican Gothic in some ways because there is things with mushrooms going on. And yeah, I thought this book was so good. It was so creepy. Lots of creepy crawly moments, like body horror moments with these mushrooms and things, and just very unsettling and everything I want from a story like this. And again, I loved the characters. I thought they were all fleshed out really well, even though it's a short story. I had a good feel for all of the characters, and I really liked our protagonist. And yeah, I just thought it did the job. It was very creepy, very unsettling, very entertaining. It was a quick read. I've heard the audiobook is not good. I physically read this, so that is what I would recommend, because on Goodreads, a lot of people complained about how the audiobook ruined it for them and they couldn't even finish it. But yeah, very suspenseful, very thrilling, very creepy. I'm just using all of the same adjectives at this point. So basically, I loved this one and I would highly recommend it. And now on to the number 1 book for this month, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So I love Frankenstein. I have read it before. So maybe it almost seems unfair to place it at number 1, considering it's a book that I know I love. but I've never talked about it on my channel before. So anyway, this one I like because I feel like there's so many ways you can interpret this and so much symbolism and metaphors. And granted, maybe there's people make this mean something more than what Shelley had even intended, and it's gotten to the point where we're seeing things in the story that she hadn't even meant. But nonetheless, I honestly don't see anything wrong with that. Like if I wrote a story and people came up with all these various interpretations and made it deeper than I had meant it to be, I don't think I would be bothered by that. But yeah, so I feel like you can read this and always get something new out of it. And it's also just a great monster story, but it's one where you feel sorry for the monster and you actually like him better than the creator. And so just so many levels in this book and so much symbolism. And so I really enjoyed it. It's also a quick read too, pretty short. And it's also just so iconic and so incredible, right? And I do think Shelley has some great prose and there's some great moments in here, some great lines of dialogue. And since this is the #1 book of the month, now I decide if it is better than my current 2022 champion, which right now is The Grapes of Wrath, which, speaking of how this month there were certain books I wasn't like, I decided on the order, but I could see myself changing my mind in the future. I feel this way about last month's reading wrap up because I named Grapes of Wrath as being better than Rebecca. But this past month, my mind has returned more to Rebecca than it has Grapes of Wrath. So in some ways, I'm like, should Rebecca have been #1 then? But Grapes of Wrath is just so beautifully written. I mean, Rebecca was beautifully written too, though. I don't know. I guess between Rebecca, Grapes of Wrath, and Frankenstein, I do think Grapes of Wrath has like the better prose and is probably just like more technically better written. Although, yeah, I love Rebecca. This is tough, yeah. Which Rebecca wasn't even supposed to be in this mix because Rebecca didn't become the #1 book. But so yeah, trying to decide. I mean, I guess I'll stick with my decision to have Grapes of Wrath be the #1 book, which means it's Grapes of Wrath versus Frankenstein. And again, I do think the prose of Grapes of Wrath are far better, but then the story of Frankenstein is just one that will stick with you. And again, a lot of symbolism. Grapes of Wrath, it's a historical novel, not necessarily much symbolism there. It's just telling you the experience of these people. But I do love Frankenstein. I've only read Grapes of Wrath once as well, whereas Frankenstein I have read multiple times, so I feel like I'm biased in some ways because of that. This is tough. Yeah, honestly, like part of me wants to say Frankenstein is the new 2022 champion, but then I'm like, is it better though than Grapes of Wrath or Rebecca? I think for now I am going to say Grapes of Wrath is still the 2022 champion because I think it is the better written book. And I think all of the characters are really fleshed out, whereas in Frankenstein, we get a feel for Frankenstein and the monster, but, you know, like Elizabeth, I wish she had a bigger role in the book. Whereas, yeah, Grapes of Wrath, like all of the characters you get such a good feel for. But then I really do love Frankenstein. And I love Rebecca. But I gotta make a decision. So I guess I will still say The Grapes of Wrath. Although, looking like way back into the year, not way back, but a few months ago, when I think of Sometimes a Great Notion, part of me wishes that one hadn't been knocked off its 2022 champion status because that one was a great one. But yeah, I don't know. I'd be breaking my own rules if I brought that in the mix at this point because Bullet Train I actually chose over Sometimes a Great Notion. So that's a choice where I've second guessed it as I look back. But anyway, I am just gonna say that Grapes of Wrath is still 2022 champion. That's what I'm gonna say. But I do love Frankenstein. So anyway, enough hemming and hawing. That's what I'm gonna say. Grapes of Wrath still wins. Let's see what kind of books I read in November, and maybe one of those will take the new #1 spot. But anyway, thank you for watching. Happy Halloween. Let me know down below in the comments if you have read any of these books and what you thought about them, and if you agree with my ratings. If you think any of these deserve a higher rating or a lower rating, comment down below what your thoughts were down in the comments. And yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe. My Frankenstein book first movie will be out this Wednesday, November 2nd. So definitely check that one out. And then again, I have my Bullet Train prequel for Three Assassins coming out again in November, the 2nd week. So yeah, like, subscribe, comment, share my channel, all of that good stuff. And I will see you next time. Bye. Oh, by the way, check out my earrings. Cute Halloween ones. But anyway, see you next time.